The sky over Rome is turning the color of a bruise. Just outside the city walls, on a low hill the locals call the Vatican Fields, a small crowd of soldiers stands in a loose circle. And in the center of that circle, on his knees, is an old fisherman from Galilee. His hands are bound. His beard is gray now, gone thin at the chin. You can see the calluses on his palms, decades of hauling nets in the Sea of Galilee, hardened into something that never fully left him, even after everything else changed. Picture yourself standing at the edge of that circle. You would not have guessed, looking at him, that you were watching one of the most famous deaths in human history about to happen in near silence. His name is Peter. You know this man. Or you think you do. The one who walked on water and sank. The one who swore he would die before he denied his teacher, and denied him 3 times before a rooster finished crowing. The one who was handed the keys, and then handed a cross of his own, decades later, in a city that was never his home. The executioners are ready. The wood is already standing. And then Peter says something. One sentence. A request so specific, so strange, that the soldiers pause and look at each other. We will come back to that sentence. Hold on to it. Because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why a man who spent 3 years walking beside Jesus of Nazareth would ask for the one thing no one expects a dying man to ask for. Here's what you need to understand first, before you meet the other 11. This is not a story about how 12 men died. This is not a tale of ancient superstition dressed up as history. This is not a legend passed down by frightened old men trying to comfort themselves. This is an account of 12 ordinary tradesmen, fishermen, a tax collector, a political revolutionary, who had one easy way out of every threat made against them. A single sentence. I never knew him. That's all it would have taken. Not one of them said it. Stay with me, because what happened to each of these men, Peter and Andrew and James and John and the rest, is scattered across letters and histories written in the first few centuries after they died. Some of it is certain, some of it is disputed, and some of it, as you'll see, the Bible records in its own 2 hands, in 2 very different ways. You are about to walk the road each of them walked, one at a time. We start where the earliest record starts. Not with Peter's death. We're saving that for the end, where it belongs. We start with the first apostle to die, and the man who executed him. The year is AD 44. The king is Herod Agrippa I, grandson of the Herod who tried to kill Jesus as an infant, and every bit as ruthless. He is watching the young Christian movement grow inside his own territory, and he decides to make an example of someone close to Jesus. He chooses James, not the famous James who wrote the New Testament letter. This is James, son of Zebedee, brother of John, one of the inner 3 Jesus trusted most, present at the Transfiguration, present in Gethsemane. Years earlier, Jesus had turned to James and John and asked them a question they answered too quickly. Could they drink the cup he was about to drink? They said yes. You get the sense they had no idea what they were agreeing to. Now Herod's soldiers come for James, and he is beheaded. Scripture records this one plainly. No embellishment, no final speech, just a king's order carried out with a sword. But here's what most people miss. An early writer named Clement of Alexandria, and later, the historian Eusebius, repeating him, preserves a detail Scripture doesn't. The man assigned to guard James and drag him to trial watched how James carried himself, watched him face the accusation without flinching, and something in that composure undid him. On the way to the execution, the guard turned to James and asked for forgiveness. James thought for a moment. Then he embraced the man and said, "Peace be with you." The guard converted on the spot, and when the blade came down that day, it came down twice. 2 men died for the same faith on the same afternoon, one of whom had arrested the other only hours before. If you had been standing in that crowd, you would have watched an execution turn into something closer to a baptism. That's the first death. Now go with me to the far side of the empire, decades later, to a rocky island called Patmos in the Aegean Sea. An old man is here, exiled, alone, cut off from every church he ever planted. His name is John, James's own brother, the last living member of the inner 3. Emperor Domitian has sent him here for one reason. He will not stop saying that Jesus rose from the dead. Some accounts say that before this exile, Rome tried something else first. They plunged him into a vat of boiling oil outside the city gate, in front of a crowd, expecting him to die publicly and quickly. He didn't die. He walked away scarred and unshaken and still preaching. You have to sit with that for a second. Every other apostle in this account dies at the hands of an enemy. John outlives all of them. He watches his own brother die by the sword. He watches, from a distance, as reports reach him of one execution after another. Men he ate breakfast with. Men he watched Jesus heal the sick alongside. And he is left on a barren rock in the middle of the sea with nothing to do but write down the vision God gives him there. That vision becomes the last book of the Bible. Imagine writing Revelation with no one left to read it to. Loneliness, it turns out, can be its own kind of martyrdom. Here's the part nobody tells you. There is a word buried in the language of the New Testament that explains why none of this destroyed their faith instead of building it. The Greek word is martys. Today you hear that word and think only of dying. But that isn't what it meant to the people who first used it. Martys means witness. A courtroom word. Someone standing in front of a judge, giving an account of what they saw with their own eyes, regardless of the cost of saying it out loud. Every single death in this account is, first, a testimony. The dying is just what happened after the testifying didn't stop. One more story before the midpoint. Andrew, Peter's own brother, the first of the 12 to follow Jesus at all, before Peter, before anyone. Tradition sends him east, into Scythia, and eventually to Greece, to a city called Patmos. There, the Roman governor orders him crucified for turning too many wives of prominent men to the new faith. Later tradition remembers the cross itself as different from the standard Roman upright beam. Shaped like an X, the diagonal cross that would one day carry his name across flags and coats of arms for 2,000 years afterward. Accounts differ on the details. What they agree on is this: Andrew did not run. You don't get many chances in life to know exactly what you do standing where he stood. He didn't need one. 3 men. 3 different deaths. One executioner converted mid-task. One survived what should have killed him and lived out his days in exile. One died on a cross shaped like his own name in history. And we've only just started. Look at what's forming here. 3 men in. 3 completely different endings. And not one hesitation between them. If this is the kind of history that actually changes how you read the rest of the New Testament, do me one favor before we go further. Hit subscribe, because you and I are about to go through 9 more of these, and some of them are going to be harder to hear than the ones you just heard. And drop a comment right now with just one word. Which apostle story, so far, are you thinking about the most? Now, back to the road. For more men are waiting for you, and the stakes are about to climb higher than a single execution. Travel now to a city called Hierapolis, in what is now modern Turkey, a place known in the ancient world for its white mineral terraces and its hot springs, believed by locals to have healing power. This is where Philip's account ends, and this is where the record gets strangely quiet. The oldest source we have on Philip is a bishop named Polycrates, writing near the end of the 2nd century, and preserved for us by Eusebius. Polycrates doesn't describe a trial. He doesn't describe a sword or a cross. He simply says that Philip fell asleep in Hierapolis, an old, gentle phrase the early church used for believers who died at peace, not under violence. Pay attention to this, because it matters more than you'd think. Later writers, centuries after, added dramatic martyrdom stories to Philip's ending. Inverted crosses, angry crowds, miraculous signs. But the earliest voice we have, the one closest to Philip's own lifetime, doesn't ask you to believe in a violent death at all. It simply says he finished his work and went to sleep. Not every apostle needed a dramatic ending to prove what he believed. Sometimes faithfulness looks like an ordinary, unremarkable death in a foreign city, far from home, having said everything you came to say. You may find that version harder to shake than the violent ones. Now the tone shifts. Hard. Bartholomew is sent by tradition into Armenia, a mountain kingdom on the edge of the known world, to preach to a people who worship different gods entirely. And according to the oldest layers of Armenian church memory, his preaching succeeds well enough to threaten the local authorities, so they have him flayed alive, the skin stripped from his body before he is finally beheaded. There is a reason painters, centuries later, would show Bartholomew holding his own skin in one hand like a folded coat. It is one of the most graphic deaths in this entire account. And Armenia still calls him one of its founding apostles today, because whatever was done to his body, it didn't erase what he'd already planted in that country before he died. You can visit churches in that region today, still named for him. But it gets stranger still. Thomas, the disciple you probably remember for doubting the resurrection until he touched the wounds himself, is sent, by Eusebius' own account, all the way into Parthia, and by wider tradition, deep into India, farther than any other apostle is said to travel. Indian Christian communities today, some of the oldest continuous Christian populations on earth, trace their founding directly to Thomas's arrival on their coast. Tradition holds that he was killed there with a spear, run through on a hillside outside a city, for refusing to stop preaching to a population the local ruling class did not want converted. Think about that for a moment, because it's worth sitting with. The one apostle famous for needing physical proof of the resurrection, for putting his own fingers in the wounds before he'd believe, is the same apostle who carried that same resurrection message farther than anyone else and paid for it with a wound of his own. If you ever doubted, you're in good company. Thomas turned his doubt into the longest missionary road of all 12. There's a word for what these men understood themselves to be, and it isn't fully captured by the English word apostle. In the Hebrew legal tradition their Jewish culture grew out of, there is a role called the shaliach, a sent agent, someone who carries the full legal authority and voice of the one who sent them, so completely that meeting the agent is treated as meeting the sender himself. That is the weight the 12 believed they were carrying. Not messengers with an opinion you could take or leave. Agents with the authority of the one who commissioned them. One more account before the midpoint of our climb. Matthew, the tax collector, the man least likely of the 12, the one who worked for Rome collecting money from his own people before Jesus called him away from the booth entirely. His death is the hardest of all 12 to pin down, and you should know that going in. Hippolytus, one of our earliest sources, simply says Matthew died in Parthia. No violence recorded at all. Centuries later, other traditions claim he was speared to death while preaching in a distant land, but these accounts conflict with each other and with the earlier record. Here's what's remarkable about Matthew. Regardless of how his death looked, he is the one who left the most behind. A stable government job, a guaranteed income, a life of comfort collecting taxes under Roman protection, for a traveling rabbi with nowhere to lay his head. Whatever his death looked like, his life had already made its statement, and maybe you don't need a violent ending to prove a life meant something. For men, a quiet death in a healing city, a flaying in the mountains of Armenia, a spear on a hillside in India, an ending lost to uncertain history. And still, not one of them turned back. Now we reach the hardest stretch of this account. Not because the deaths get more violent, though some of them do, but because here, the stakes stop being personal and start being eternal. You're about to see what happens when faith gets passed from one generation straight into another. Start in Jerusalem, in the early years of the 60s. A man known as James, son of Alphaeus. Some traditions connect him to James, the brother of the Lord, the man who led the Jerusalem church itself, though scholars still debate whether these are the same James. What both Eusebius and the Jewish historian Josephus agree on is this. The religious authorities in Jerusalem grew tired of his influence, dragged him to the top of the temple, and demanded he publicly deny that Jesus was the Messiah. He refused, in front of the crowd gathered below. So they threw him from the height of the temple wall. He survived the fall, and while he knelt in the street, praying for the very men who'd thrown him, they finished the job with stones. He died the way Stephen died, decades earlier, begging forgiveness for his executioners with his final breath. You have to wonder what it takes to pray for the people killing you while they're still killing you. Now go north with me, into Armenia and Persia, where tradition sends two more of the 12 together. Thaddeus, sometimes called Jude, and Simon, once a member of a violent revolutionary faction called the Zealots, before Jesus called him away from politics into something larger than any nation. These two very different men, one a quiet relative of Jesus, one a former political radical, end up preaching side by side in the same foreign kingdom, and tradition holds they are martyred together there, in the same campaign of persecution. Some accounts say clubbed to death. Others say Simon was sawn in half. The details vary. The pairing does not. A peacemaker and a former revolutionary, dying together for the same account, having spent their whole lives, before Jesus, on opposite ends of how a person should respond to Roman occupation. And then there's Matthias, chosen by drawing lots to replace the 12th seat left empty by betrayal. Eusebius sends him to Ethiopia. Other traditions send him to Syria alongside Andrew. Some accounts say he was stoned. Others say burned. The truth is, history barely remembers how Matthias died at all. He is the quietest name in this entire account, and maybe that's exactly right. Not every act of faithfulness gets recorded. Most of them don't. You will probably never be remembered for most of what you do either. That doesn't make it count for less. Which brings us, finally, to the 12th name that started all of this. Judas Iscariot. Here is something the Bible does that should stop you cold if you've never noticed it before. Scripture records Judas's death twice, in two different books, in two accounts that do not fully agree with each other. Matthew says Judas, overwhelmed with regret, hanged himself. Acts says he fell, and his body burst open in a field bought with the betrayal money. Two accounts, two authors, neither one smoothed over to match the other. This is not a coincidence. This is not sloppy record-keeping someone forgot to fix. This is not a mistake anyone tried to hide. This is exactly what happens when real witnesses tell a true account from two different angles, without coordinating their testimony first. 11 men chose death over denial. One man chose betrayal, and died in a manner so disturbing that even the writers who recorded it couldn't agree on every detail. Only on the fact that it was ugly, and it was final, and it was entirely his own doing. Now, back to the hillside outside Rome, where we started. You've earned the answer. Peter is on his knees. The wood is standing, and he says his sentence to the soldiers around him. He asks to be crucified upside down, not out of despair, out of something closer to reverence. This is a man who denied his teacher 3 times in one night, by a charcoal fire, to a servant girl who wasn't even a real threat to him. He has carried that shame for over 30 years. And now, given the exact same death his Lord died, he cannot bring himself to accept it the same way. He tells the soldiers he is not worthy to die, facing the sky the same direction Jesus did. So they turn him over. And Peter dies with his head toward the ground he came from, and his feet reaching up toward the sky he's about to enter. You can picture it now, can't you? 19 centuries later, in a Nazi prison cell, a pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer waited for his own execution with that same unshaken calm. Different century, different empire. Same refusal to take the easy sentence that would have saved his life. This is not a pattern that started with the apostles, and it did not end with them either. It might, one day, ask something of you too, though hopefully never anything like this. So here's what 12 lives and 12 deaths actually leave you with. Takeaway 1, and this one is simply factual. The Bible itself only records 2 of these deaths directly, James by the sword and Judas by his own hand. Everything else you just heard comes from the generation that knew these men personally, and the generation right after that. Eusebius, Clement, Hippolytus, Josephus, writing close enough to the events that outright fabrication would have been laughed out of every church that remembered what really happened. Takeaway 2, and this one is personal. Every single one of these men had an easy way out. One sentence. I never knew him. Herod would have let James walk. Rome would have let Peter live out his days quietly. Not one of them said it. Not once, not under torture, not at the very end when saying it would have cost them nothing but their pride. You have probably never faced a test that extreme, but you've faced smaller versions of the same choice more times than you'd like to admit. And takeaway 3, the one that actually matters. So give this last part your full attention. These men didn't die defending an idea, or a philosophy, or even a religion, the way you might defend a belief you simply find comforting. They died defending an eyewitness account. Something they said, specifically, that they saw with their own eyes, a man who was dead, and then was not. People will die for a lot of things they believe. It is far rarer for 11 people to independently choose brutal death, rather than recant a single event they all claim to have physically witnessed together. So here's the question for you. Out of the 12 accounts you just heard, Peter's request on the hillside, James and his converted executioner, John outliving everyone he loved, Bartholomew in the mountains, Thomas in India, or any of the rest? Which one is sitting with you right now? Tell me below. I read every comment you leave. If any part of this changed how you see the resurrection they all claim to witness, that alone was worth the 25 minutes you just spent with me. 12 men, 12 endings. one account none of them would ever take back.